It started with something so simple, you wouldn't believe how fast it spiraled out of control. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen, you'll know exactly the kind of nightmare I'm talking about. But this one is different because she didn't just pick on the wrong. Naborshe picked on the one person she could never truly control. And when the truth came out, it broke her in ways no one saw coming. So stick with me because what I'm about to tell you will make your jaw drop, and if you love seeing Karens get what they deserve, make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories because this one is going to keep you hooked from start to finish. I had been away from the valley for a few years, working long hours in the city, and the little cabin my grandfather left me had sat empty. Its weathered wooden walls blending into the landscape of pine trees and rolling hills like it had for decades. That cabin wasn't just a house, that was the heart of our family history. Tucked away in a valley most people had long forgotten. A valley where my grandfather had quietly bought up land piece by piece until by the time he passed. Every tree, every stream, every acre of open field belonged to our family name. But I didn't flaunt it. In fact, most people didn't even realize the entire valley was private land. That's why when I finally decided to come back, to restore the cabin and reconnect with the land I loved, I was blindsided by the changes. A neighborhood HOA had been built near the valley's edge. And as I drove in for the first time in years, the winding road now lined with uniform suburban homes, trimmed lawns, and posted rules, I felt out of place. I wasn't part of their HOA, and my cabin was miles away in the valley proper. But it didn't take long before Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, noticed me. I'll never forget the first time we met. She stormed up the dirt path leading to my cabin, clipboard in hand, lips pursed so tightly it looked painful, demanding to know what I was doing, squatting on community property. I tried to explain politely that this was my family's land, that my cabin had been here longer than any of their homes, but she didn't listen, barking about HOA codes, lawn standards, and fines that supposedly applied to me. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a misunderstanding, but Karen wasn't the type to let go of anything. Over the next few days, I caught her trespassing multiple times, photographing the cabin, pointing out things she considered violations, the chopped wood stacked near the porch, the tin chimney pipe that didn't match her aesthetic, even the gravel path I'd cleared for my truck. Each time I told her the same thing. I wasn't in the HOA. Their rules didn't apply here, and she had no authority over my property. But telling Karen no was like waving a red flag at a bull. She doubled down, printing violation notices and sticking them on my door, threatening to fine me thousands, and spreading gossip among her neighbors that some stranger was camping illegally in the valley. It was almost comical if it hadn't been so invasive. Then one evening, as the sun set behind the ridgeline, I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee when I heard tires crunching on the gravel. Karen's SUV pulled up, headlights glaring. Out she came with two other HOA board members trailing behind her like obedient little soldiers. She stomped up to the porch, waving her papers, declaring that the HOA had voted to have me removed. I stood up slowly, letting her rant, and when she paused for breath, I asked her a simple question. Karen, do you even know who owns this valley? She sneered, saying it was community land under HOA management. I shook my head, walked inside, and returned with a thick leather-bound folder, my grandfather's deeds. Maps and titles, stretching back nearly a century. One by one, I spread them across the porch table. Official county seals shining under the fading light told her plainly, "This isn't your valley, Karen. It's mine. My grandfather bought every acre. Your HOA sits on leased land at the edge, and your board pays me annually for the privilege of existing here." Her face turned pale, her confidence cracking for the first time. As the realization sank in that she wasn't dealing with some random squatter, she was standing on the property of the man who effectively owned her entire neighborhood. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She stammered something about legal loopholes and new developments, trying to salvage her pride. But her board members were already shifting uncomfortably, realizing they had been lied to about the land's ownership. That night, as I watched her drive away in a fury, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen couldn't stand being wrong, and she certainly couldn't stand being powerless. In her mind, I was a threat not just to her authority, but but to the image of control she held over the neighborhood. She wasn't going to let it go, and I had no idea just how far she was willing to go to try to break me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of distant voices, and when I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, I saw Karen and a group of neighbors parked along the dirt road near the valley entrance, pointing at my cabin as though they were surveying an enemy outpost. And I knew instantly that she had spun some elaborate tale about me to rally her followers. They had posters, clipboards, even a man filming on his phone, as if they were about to document some heroic eviction. And sure enough, Karen strutted forward like a general leading troops, shouting that the community had spoken and that I was trespassing on protected HOA property. I laughed, partly out of disbelief, partly because the whole circus was so absurd. And I reminded her again, calmly but firmly, that she and her neighbors were standing on land my grandfather had purchased decades ago, land that was not governed by their HOA. Land they only leased the edges of with annual payments their board had apparently neglected to mention to them. A few of the residents looked uneasy, whispering to each other, but Karen doubled down, waving papers in the air that she claimed were new ordinances giving her control of the valley, though from the distance I could see they were nothing more than copied HOA bylaws that held no legal weight. To prove my point, I walked back inside and returned with one of the county's stamped deeds, holding it up so the crowd could see, and explained clearly that every acre, every pine tree, every creek running through this valley was under my family's name, and that if they didn't believe me, they could verify it themselves at the county clerk's office. That caused more murmuring among the neighbors, some of whom were beginning to realize that Karen's authority wasn't as absolute as she portrayed it, but rather than retreat, she lashed out, calling me a liar, a squatter, a fraud, her voice shrill with desperation as she demanded the others not believe me. Then, in an act of pure spite, she marched up to my property line and began tearing down the wooden private property signs my grandfather had posted decades ago, declaring loudly that she hereby reclaimed this land for the HOA. My jaw tightened, but instead of reacting in anger, I pulled out my phone and filmed her, calmly narrating who she was, what she was doing, and the fact that she was destroying property that didn't belong to her. That only enraged her further, but it also made several of her supporters back away, clearly uncomfortable being caught in the middle of something that looked very much like trespassing and vandalism. When she realized she was losing her audience, Karen stomped back to her SUV and screamed that she would be filing official complaints, calling the sheriff and having me arrested if I didn't pack up and leave by the end of the week. Then she roared off in a cloud of dust, her little entourage following more hesitantly, their loyalty shaken. I knew that wasn't the end, though it was just the opening move in what was quickly becoming a war of wills. Later that afternoon, sure enough, a deputy's cruiser rolled up the gravel drive, and a young officer stepped out, looking uncomfortable as he explained that he had been sent to investigate a complaint about an illegal squatter. I handed him the deed folder, let him take photos of the official seals, and even called the county clerk on speakerphone so he could hear for himself that my family's ownership was indisputable. The deputy apologized profusely, shaking his head as he admitted that Karen had a reputation for abusing 911 calls to get her way, and he assured me he would file a report noting that the claim was unfounded. Still, I could see the frustration in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd had to deal with her antics, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Sure enough, over the next week, Karen escalated in every possible way. One morning, I woke to find trash bags dumped along my driveway. Another day, I discovered spray-painted insults across my fence. And once, while I was out gathering supplies, I returned to find she had set up orange HOA violation cones around my cabin as if trying to mark it for demolition. Each time, I documented everything with photos and videos, filing reports with the sheriff's office, who by now were growing tired of her antics, though until she crossed a serious line, their hands were tied. The neighbors began to split into two camps, those still loyal to Karen's iron grip, and those who had started visiting me quietly, asking questions about the valley's ownership, expressing disbelief at the lies they had been told, and even apologizing for being swept up in her hysteria. One elderly couple told me Karen had assured them the HOA owned the whole valley and that it was some drifter squatting illegally. But when I showed them the deeds, their faces fell in embarrassment, and they promised to speak up at the next board meeting. Word began to spread that maybe Karen wasn't the trustworthy leader she claimed to be, and that terrified her, because her entire power relied on keeping the neighborhood under her thumb. So, in her most desperate move yet, she returned with her board members one evening carrying a stack of cease and desist letters, which she slammed onto my porch table while declaring she would sue me for everything I had. I didn't even have to raise my voice. I simply told her that not only were her papers meaningless, but if she continued harassing me or stepping foot on my property again, I would file for a restraining order and sue her personally for damages and trespass. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face, quickly hidden behind bluster, but the cracks were there. She left in a fury, her minions trailing silently, and I knew she was beginning to realize just how much trouble she had gotten herself into. The valley was mine, every acre of it, and no amount of bullying or paper waving would change that fact. Yet if there's one thing I had learned, it was that Karen was the kind of person who would rather burn everything down than admit defeat. And as the sun sank that evening behind the pines, I had no doubt the storm was only beginning. The following week turned into a tense standoff where every day brought a new attempt from Karen to assert dominance. But each one only pushed her further into a corner as her neighbors began to question why she was so obsessed with me and my cabin. And it became clear she couldn't stand the idea that someone else might hold more power than she did in the valley. She began sending out daily HOA violation notices stuffed into my mailbox, even though I wasn't part of the HOA. And each one was written in bold red letters declaring fines of hundreds of dollars for things like non-approved cabin color, unauthorized vegetation growth, and even failure to comply with HOA safety inspections, which I found hilarious, but also infuriating. Because it wasn't just harassment, it was an attempt to create a paper trail she could use to sway the more gullible members of her neighborhood. I documented every letter, piling them into a binder labeled Karen's harassment that was growing thicker by the day. Because deep down I knew this might end up in court, and if it did, I wanted a record of everything she had done. But it wasn't just letters soon. She began organizing so-called community patrols, groups of her loyal neighbors walking the edges of my driveway at night with flashlights, muttering about safety checks while clearly just trying to intimidate me. I stood on my porch with a spotlight and recorded them, calling out cheerfully that they were trespassing, which sent a few scurrying away. Though Karen herself never showed during those patrols, she preferred to let others do her dirty work while she schemed. Then, one evening, as I sat inside reading by the fireplace, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked out to see two unfamiliar trucks pulling up. Contractors hired by the HOA, they began unloading equipment, talking about surveying the valley for upcoming development plans, and I stormed outside to demand who had sent them. When they mentioned Karen by name, I nearly laughed, but my anger was sharp as I told them plainly they were on private property and had no right to touch a single tree or blade of grass here. They looked uneasy, muttered apologies, and left quickly once I showed them the deed copies. Clearly realizing they had been duped into trespassing, word of that spread quickly. Within days, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip about how Karen had wasted HOA funds on a project that wasn't even legal, which sparked outrage among the more level-headed residents who began to openly question her leadership. That should have been enough to stop her. But Karen wasn't someone who admitted defeat. Instead, she doubled down, launching a smear campaign against me. Flyers began appearing in people's mailboxes, claiming I was a dangerous criminal with a history of violence, that my cabin was an unsafe hazard, and that my presence threatened property values. She even doctored old news clippings, with my name pasted over mug shots of other men. A pathetic attempt to scare people into siding with her. But when one of those neighbors brought a flyer to me, I knew it was time to hit back. I gathered the evidence, marched straight into the sheriff's office, and filed a formal harassment complaint. The deputies were sympathetic, clearly fed up with Karen's antics. But they reminded me that unless she directly trespassed or caused property damage again, the legal system moved slowly. Still, they took the complaint seriously, and for the first time, I felt like the tide might be turning. Meanwhile, the division in the neighborhood grew sharper, one side blindly loyal to Karen, shouting that the valley should belong to the HOA, and the other realizing she had lied for years about what the HOA controlled. A few even visited my cabin to apologize, bringing homemade bread, firewood, and stories about how Karen bullied anyone who questioned her, and they admitted they were tired of living under her thumb. I welcomed them, explained the true history of the valley and my family's ownership, and slowly allies began to emerge. But Karen wasn't done. She decided to weaponize law enforcement again. One Friday night, as I sat eating dinner, I heard sirens. And within minutes, half a dozen sheriff cruisers lit up my driveway like a Christmas tree. Officers piled out with flashlights and announced they had received a 911 call claiming, "Oh, there was a hostage situation inside my cabin." My heart dropped, because this was no longer just harassment it was a dangerous swatting attempt. And it could have gotten me killed. I stepped out calmly with my hands raised, explaining everything, showing them my ID and deeds. And after a tense half hour, they realized it was another false report. The deputies were furious, one of them muttering that if they could trace the call, Karen was going to face serious consequences. I knew then that she had crossed a line so reckless, even her most loyal followers would question her sanity. The next morning, sure enough, word spread like wildfire that Karen had likely been behind the false 911 call. And for the first time, some of her supporters began to distance themselves publicly, avoiding her street meetings and whispering about whether they should demand her resignation as HOA president. Still, Karen didn't back down. She stormed into the valley herself that Sunday, screaming across the fields that she would never allow me to steal her community, that she would fight me until the end. And as her voice echoed off the trees, I realized she had lost touch with reality entirely. She wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting the truth, the collapse of the little empire of fear she had built over the years. That night, as I sat on my porch, watching the stars glimmer over the valley, I knew this battle was far from over. But I also knew something else Karen was unraveling, and when people like her unraveled, they often destroyed themselves faster than anyone else could. I had the deeds, the law, and now the growing support of neighbors on my side. And though the fight was exhausting, I was determined to see it through. For my grandfather's memory, for the valley he had loved, and for the simple principle that bullies like Karen didn't get to rewrite reality just because it suited them. I was ready for whatever came next. The weeks leading up to the court date felt like the calm before the storm. Though there was nothing calm about the way Karen flailed as her grip over the neighborhood continued to slip away, because every day seemed to bring a new, desperate stunt from her. And every day her actions only pushed more people to my side, until the valley no longer seemed divided, but firmly aligned against her. Yet I couldn't let my guard down, because cornered animals always bite hardest, and Karen was no different. One morning, I woke to find a drone buzzing over my cabin, circling and hovering as though spying on me, and when I stepped onto the porch and waved, it darted off toward Karen's property, confirming what I already suspected, that she was now resorting to surveillance. Hoping to find anything she could twist against me in court, I called the sheriff, who reminded me that flying a drone over private property without permission bordered on harassment and trespassing. And though they couldn't arrest her just yet, they logged another complaint in the ever-thickening file with her name all over it. Later that week, I noticed Karen plastering new flyers all over the neighborhood, this time announcing a Save Our Valley rally at the community park, with bold letters declaring the first was a fraud, an invader, and a thief who had stolen land from the HOA. But when the day came, barely a dozen people showed up, most of them elderly residents who looked uncomfortable even being there. While across the street, nearly 50 neighbors gathered on their porches, openly mocking Karen's theatrics, and some even holding up signs of their own that read, "Enough. Karen and Truth Matters." The humiliation was written all over her face as she screamed into her megaphone. But instead of cowing people into silence, she had become the punchline of every joke, and even her closest allies were drifting away. Still, the humiliation only drove her further into madness. And 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of my dogs barking furiously, the motion lights flaring on, and when I rushed outside with a flashlight, I saw smoke rising from the far side of my property where I kept firewood stacked for winter. By the time I got there, flames were licking up the woodpile. Clearly doused in accelerant, but thankfully the fire hadn't spread, and with the help of a hose I managed to contain it. The smell of gasoline lingered in the air, unmistakable. And though I couldn't prove Karen had been the one holding the match, everyone knew who was behind it. And the sheriff who came out that night muttered under his breath that it was only a matter of time before she slipped up completely and gave them the hard evidence they needed. But even with the danger escalating, I refused to back down, and if anything, the community's resolve to stand with me grew stronger. Neighbors brought me extra fire extinguishers, helped me reinforce the fencing around my property, and even organized watch shifts to keep an eye on the valley. Because by then, it was clear to everyone that Karen was willing to burn the world down rather than admit defeat. Yet as the court date drew closer, I could feel the tension tightening like a rope, and I knew Karen had one last card to play. Sure enough, the day before the hearing, I was served with a massive packet of evidence Karen had submitted to the court, hundreds of pages of fabricated documents. Doctored maps, and even falsified photographs she claimed proved my deeds were forgeries. And while I laughed at the sheer absurdity of it, I also marveled at the time and energy she must have poured into creating this fantasy world. My lawyer, however, wasn't rattled in the slightest. He flipped through the papers with a smirk, pointing out obvious mistakes, like dates that didn't line up and signatures from officials who had been retired for decades. And he assured me that once we walked into that courtroom, Karen's lies would crumble like dry leaves. Still, the morning of the hearing, as I dressed in my best suit and gathered the thick binder of evidence I had built, I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the valley, the neighbors who had endured Karen's tyranny for years, and the memory of my grandfather who had worked so hard to preserve this land. When I arrived at the courthouse, I was stunned to see nearly half the neighborhood gathered outside. Some holding signs of support, others just there to witness the showdown. And as I walked through the crowd, people clapped my shoulder, whispered encouragement, and told me they were praying for justice. Across the plaza, Karen emerged with her entourage, dressed in a bright red suit that made her look more like she was heading into a political rally than a courtroom, waving to the few stragglers still loyal to her, and glaring daggers at me as if she believed sheer hatred could change the truth. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation as the judge, a stern woman with decades of experience, called the case to order, and Karen immediately began her performance, standing to deliver a rambling opening statement about community, heritage, and the evil squatter who had come to destroy everything she had built. She waved her stack of falsified documents like a holy text, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. And when she finished, a few scattered coughs broke the silence, but no one applauded. Then it was our turn, and my attorney stood calmly, presenting the real deeds, the certified maps, and the notarized history of ownership that traced my family's rights back generations, laying it all out so plainly even a child could understand. He methodically dismantled every piece of Karen's so-called evidence, exposing her forged signatures, her falsified timelines, and her deliberate attempts to deceive the court. And as he spoke, I watched Karen's face go pale, her hands twitching as she shuffled her papers, clearly realizing the walls were closing in. When the judge asked her directly about the discrepancies, Karen stammered, tried to deflect, and eventually erupted into a shouting tirade about conspiracies, corruption, and how everyone was against her. But the judge silenced her with a bang of the gavel, warning that another outburst would land her in contempt. By the time the hearing ended, the outcome was obvious. The judge ruled decisively in my favor, dismissing Karen's lawsuit with prejudice, awarding me damages for harassment and legal fees, and referring her misuse of HOA funds for further investigation. The gavel struck, and just like that, the legal battle was over. But the war for the valley's peace wasn't finished, because Karen stormed out of the courtroom screaming that this wasn't the end, that she would never give up, and that I would regret crossing her. Outside, however, the neighborhood erupted in cheers, hugging me, shaking my hand, and telling me that, for the first time in years, they felt free, But in the back of my mind, I knew Karen's threats weren't idle, and that her final act of defiance might still be waiting. The fallout from Karen's desperate and reckless attempt to weaponize law enforcement against me left the valley simmering with tension, and I could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade of control, because neighbors who once followed her blindly now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering among themselves that she had gone too far. But Karen was not one to retreat quietly, and the more isolated she became, the more unhinged her actions grew. The following week, I woke to find spray paint scrawled across my cabin's stone foundation. Words like "Get out" and "HOA forever," written in jagged red letters that looked as though she wanted to mark me as an enemy of her imagined kingdom. And though it infuriated me, I took photos from my growing evidence file, then calmly scrubbed the stone clean, determined not to let her see me rattled. Later that day, I discovered fresh tire tracks cutting across my meadow, leading to a broken section of fencing. Proof that someone, likely Karen or one of her few remaining allies, had deliberately driven onto my land in the night. And the brazenness of it made my blood boil. But I also knew it meant she was becoming desperate. Because people who are losing control often lash out in ways that only hurt themselves further. That evening, I received a call from the sheriff's office letting me know they had traced the false 911 call to a burner phone, purchased with a credit card tied to one of Karen's associates, a man who served as her so-called community enforcer, and they were moving forward with questioning, which made me realize the walls were closing in on her even faster than I had imagined. But Karen didn't go quietly, she doubled down, organizing what she called an emergency HOA assembly in the neighborhood clubhouse, demanding all members attend to discuss what she framed as the illegal occupation of valley property by an outsider. I wasn't invited, of course, but several sympathetic neighbors secretly recorded the meeting and showed me the footage later. In it, Karen ranted for nearly an hour, her voice rising to a shrill pitch as she waved papers around, claiming she had proof my deeds were fake, that my family never owned the valley, and that I was a fraud trying to seize land that belonged to the community. She even slammed her fist on the podium, promising to take the fight to the state level, insisting she would appeal to higher authorities until justice was served. But instead of applause, her tirade was met with uncomfortable silence, a few scattered coughs, and then open confrontation as one brave neighbor stood up and shouted that she was lying, that everyone knew she was wasting their dues money on personal vendettas, and that they wanted her gone. The room erupted into chaos, with shouts and arguments breaking out, and Karen stormed out red-faced, leaving the meeting unfinished, which told me more than anything that her grip was slipping. Still, I couldn't relax, because people like Karen rarely stopped before they burned everything around them down, and my fears were justified when just 2 nights later, I heard rustling outside and saw flames licking up the edge of my hay storage shed. Heart pounding, I grabbed a fire extinguisher and managed to put it out before it spread. But the damage was obvious. It was arson, and the message was clear. I called the sheriff immediately, who dispatched investigators. And though they couldn't prove Karen herself had lit the fire, all evidence pointed back to the HOA conflict, and several deputies told me privately they had no doubt she was behind it, though they needed concrete proof before they could act. As much as I wanted to see her hauled away in handcuffs right then, I also knew patience was key, so I reinforced my fences, installed motion cameras, and prepared for the inevitable escalation. Meanwhile, support from the wider community grew stronger, with neighbors volunteering to help me rebuild the scorched shed, bringing tools, boards, and even food, as if they too understood this fight wasn't just about me, but about resisting the tyrant who had ruled over them with intimidation for too long. Seeing their willingness to stand up warmed something inside me, reminding me of my grandfather's stories about how the valley folk used to come together in hard times, and it made me even more determined to hold my ground. Yet Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. A week later, I received a certified letter, not from her directly but from a law firm in the city, claiming that the HOA was pursuing a civil suit against me for illegal residency, property fraud, and willful obstruction of community governance, and that they demanded I vacate the valley within 30 days. I read the letter twice, then laughed out loud, because the claims were so absurd I knew they would crumble under even the slightest legal scrutiny. But I also understood the danger. Karen was trying to drag me into expensive legal battles to wear me down financially. What she didn't know, of course, was that I had resources of my own, and more importantly, I had the truth. I immediately contacted a respected attorney I knew from my time working in state judicial circles, explained the situation, and within days, he filed a counterclaim against the HOA for harassment, slander, and property damage, complete with the growing binder of evidence I had meticulously documented. The move sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Suddenly it wasn't me on the defensive, but Karen and her shrinking circle, facing the possibility of real financial consequences for their reckless actions. Neighbors began holding informal gatherings without her, discussing replacing her as HOA president, and though some still feared her retaliation, many more were emboldened by the fact that someone was finally standing up to her in a way she couldn't ignore. That's when the balance truly began to shift. Karen, sensing her empire collapsing, started appearing more frantic, patrolling the streets at odd hours, shouting at passersby, and even banging on doors demanding loyalty pledges. But instead of rallying support, she only scared people further. One woman told me in tears that Karen had threatened to fine her thousands of dollars if she didn't publicly denounce me. But instead of complying, she quietly handed me a copy of the threat and swore she was ready to testify against Karen in court if it came to that. The once quiet valley had turned into a battlefield of wills, with Karen on one side clawing to keep her illusion of power alive, and me, backed by truth and growing community support, standing firm on the other. And as I sat one evening on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountain ridge, I realized that Karen had already lost the war, she just hadn't accepted it yet. And until she did, the valley was going to see more chaos. But I was ready, because this was my land, my family's legacy. And I wasn't going to let a power-drunk bully destroy it, no matter what game she played next. The lawsuit Karen had filed against me quickly became the talk of the valley, and while some feared the HOA's reach, most began to recognize it for what it truly was, a desperate attempt to cling to power by a woman who could no longer convince her neighbors with intimidation alone. But I wasn't about to let her dictate the terms of this fight, so I prepared meticulously with my attorney, gathering every scrap of evidence I had collected over the months, from the harassment letters to the recordings of her false claims, the testimony of neighbors she had bullied, and even the police records from the false 911 call and the arson attempt. Because I knew the best way to stop Karen wasn't to match her rage with mine, but to expose her lies in the one place she couldn't manipulate. In the meantime, life in the valley was a constant seesaw of tension, with Karen parading around like a self-declared queen while more and more of her subjects defected to my side, stopping by the cabin with casseroles, offers to mow grass, or just to talk about the stranglehold she had kept on them for years. And their stories only hardened my resolve, because it became clear this wasn't just my fight anymore, it was theirs too. Karen responded to her dwindling influence with increasingly erratic behavior. She had one of her loyalists park a car across my driveway in the middle of the night to block my truck, but I simply called the sheriff, who had it towed within the hour, leaving the loyalist red-faced and fuming in the road while Karen shouted from a distance that I was destroying the neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She also began mailing out glossy newsletters filled with bizarre conspiracy theories about me, claiming I was working with corporations to seize the valley, that I was secretly poisoning the river. And even that, I planned to build a prison on the land to lower their property values so I could buy them out cheap. And though the wild accusations made me laugh at first, I knew propaganda had power, so I made it my mission to counter it with simple truth. I held open porch gatherings at my cabin, inviting anyone curious to come see the land deeds themselves, explaining how my family had owned the valley for generations, and to my surprise, dozens came, sitting on hay bales or folding chairs as I shared the history of the valley, showing them the old photographs of my grandfather working the fields, my father riding the horses, and me as a boy fishing in the same stream that still flowed past the cabin. Those gatherings became something Karen could never compete with, because they were rooted in honesty and community, not fear. And one by one, her grip weakened. Still, Karen wasn't done making life miserable. One stormy night I heard pounding on the door, and when I opened it, 2 county inspectors stood on my porch, claiming they had received anonymous reports of code violations on my property. They looked uncomfortable when I asked who had filed the complaints, but it wasn't hard to guess. And when I showed them the jurisdiction boundaries proving the HOA had no authority here, their faces relaxed. And they admitted they were obligated to check only because Karen had filed over a dozen complaints in my name. They shook their heads, apologized, and left. But not before assuring me they were filing a report about Karen's misuse of county resources. That, I realized, was another nail in her coffin. Meanwhile, the legal process churned forward, and as discovery began, Karen's lies started unraveling fast. My lawyer revealed that she had used HOA funds to pay for her frivolous lawsuit, which meant every member of the HOA had unknowingly financed her vendetta against me. And when that news spread, it lit the community on fire. Furious homeowners demanded to know why their dues had gone to attack a neighbor instead of maintaining roads or repairing common areas. Some even threatened to sue her personally for mismanagement. Karen tried to spin it, claiming it was all for the good of the neighborhood, but her words rang hollow. Even her staunchest allies began to question her judgment, with some quietly reaching out to me to apologize for ever siding with her, admitting they had been too afraid to stand up until now. Watching her empire crumble from within should have been satisfying, but part of me felt uneasy. Because I knew people like Karen didn't go down peacefully, they lashed out harder the closer they came to losing everything. That fear came true one evening when I returned from town to find my cabin door splintered, the lock broken, and muddy footprints trailing inside. My stomach sank as I rushed through the rooms, heart pounding, but nothing seemed stolen. It was all destruction. Cabinets had been pulled open and left hanging, drawers dumped on the floor, the fireplace tools scattered across the rug, and worst of all, my grandfather's old rocking chair. The one piece of furniture I cherished most had been smashed to pieces. Rage boiled through me like I'd never felt before. But beneath it was a cold clarity. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a message, and there was no doubt in my mind it had come from Karen. I called the sheriff immediately, who came out, photographed everything, and promised an investigation. Though we both knew proving her direct involvement would be difficult. Still, the break-in backfired on her in the worst way. When word spread, the last of her supporters turned against her, disgusted by how far she had gone. And the valley that had once been divided now seemed united in one thought, that Karen had to go. Neighbors began openly campaigning for her removal, drafting petitions, and planning a vote of no confidence. Even the HOA board, once stacked with her loyalists, began to waver, sensing that sticking with her could drag them all down. Watching the tide shift so completely was surreal, like witnessing a storm finally break after months of thunder. But Karen herself still refused to acknowledge it, doubling down on her delusions. She stood on her porch screaming into a megaphone that I was a squatter, that the valley belonged to her, and that the world would thank her when I was gone. But the crowd of neighbors who gathered to watch didn't cheer anymore. They filmed, shaking their heads, muttering about restraining orders, and even laughing at the absurdity of it all. I realized then that Karen had become her own worst enemy, unraveling publicly in ways that no one could ignore. And though the battle wasn't over legally, the war was already won in the hearts of the people. But I couldn't celebrate yet, because deep down, I knew she was still dangerous. And people who feel power slipping away sometimes do the most damage when they're cornered. As the court date loomed closer, I steeled myself for whatever final move Karen might make, determined that no matter what she tried, the valley's truth and my family's legacy would not be erased. As the dust settled over the valley, the strange quiet that followed seemed more powerful than all the shouting, chaos, and courtroom battles that had consumed the last few months. And I realized this wasn't just the end of a dispute with Karen and her followers, but the closing chapter of a war between arrogance and truth. A reminder that no matter how far greed tries to stretch, reality has a way of pulling it back to its rightful place. And as I stood outside my cabin watching the sun sink low, painting the valley in hues of amber and gold, I thought about everything we had gone through to reach this moment. From Karen's relentless harassment to her underhanded tricks, to the fire she had stoked in her neighbors to believe in her lies, all of it unraveling in front of them once they were forced to face the truth that the valley wasn't theirs to control. The land wasn't theirs to dictate, and I wasn't someone who could be easily pushed away. The irony being that the very thing Karen tried to weaponize against me, my ownership of the entire valley, was what ultimately destroyed her credibility. Because instead of being able to twist the narrative to her advantage, it only highlighted her desperation and foolishness in thinking she could fight against something so solid, so undeniable, and now the community that once blindly followed her had begun to turn on her. Whispers turning into open anger, neighbors questioning why they had been dragged into this costly fight, asking why they had allowed themselves to be manipulated into thinking I was their enemy, when in fact I had never been anything but a quiet man looking after his home. And when the truth finally settled in, Karen was left with nothing, her authority stripped, her power reduced to bitter muttering that no one cared to hear anymore. But the story wasn't just about her downfall. It was about the valley itself, about reclaiming the peace and dignity that she had tried to rob from it. And as I walked through the fields, the air crisp and sweet with the scent of pine, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. A burden that only made sense now that it was gone. Because for too long I had let myself be defined by their hostility, by their endless attempts to drive me out, and now, with them gone, I could finally breathe in the freedom that was always mine to begin with. Though the journey hadn't come without scars, both literal and metaphorical, because the nights of worry, the threats, the vandalism, the way they made me feel like an outcast in my own home, those things leave marks on a man. And yet those scars became proof of survival, proof that even in the darkest moments, standing firm was worth it because the valley was still mine. The cabin still stood strong. My life was no longer dictated by the whims of a woman who thought herself queen of something that was never hers. And in that victory, there was also responsibility. Because while I had every legal right to shut my gates forever, to bar anyone from setting foot on the valley again, I knew the land itself wasn't meant to be locked away in bitterness. It was meant to thrive, to be a place of life and renewal. And so I made the choice to open parts of it, to let neighbors come when they asked permission, to share the beauty with those who respected it, not because I owed them anything, but because it felt right. A way to remind everyone that ownership doesn't have to mean exclusion, that strength can coexist with generosity. And as for Karen, she remained a cautionary tale. A woman so consumed by control that she ended up with none, a figure muttered about on porches and in whispers at the diner. Her name almost a punchline now, and yet even in her downfall, I felt no triumph over her. Only a quiet certainty that justice had been served. And that was enough. So when I looked back on it all, I realized the story wasn't just mine. It belonged to the valley too. To every tree and stream that had silently witnessed the fight. To the cabin that stood through storms, and to the truth that prevailed when lies tried to smother it. And maybe that's the lesson that lingers most of all, that, no matter how loud or aggressive the noise becomes, truth has its own way of echoing louder, if only you stand long enough to let it be heard. So now, as I close this chapter and think of what lies ahead, I turn to you who have followed this journey, who have walked through every twist, every moment of tension, every revelation. And I ask you to carry this story with you, not just as entertainment, but as a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's as simple as standing your ground in silence while the storm passes. And if you found yourself caught up in this tale, if you felt the pulse of justice and resilience as it unfolded, then join me in keeping these stories alive. Because there are more valleys, more cabins, more battles between right and wrong still to be told, and you can be part of them. So don't just walk away now. Make sure you're here when the next story breaks. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel and be ready for the next fight, the next twist, the next reminder that sometimes the quietest man in the valley holds the loudest truth of all.